This video was brought to you by Nebula. Not much is happening along the front lines in Ukraine at the moment. It looks like the Ukrainian army have moved away from the large-scale combined arms offensives we saw, back towards a more attritional strategy. And while this does make sense, it also means the front lines have been relatively stable recently. However, the one place where the Ukrainians have continued to make small but strategically significant gains is Bakhmut, where Ukraine has been making steady progress to the north and south, prompting anxiety amongst both Russian telegram channels and recently mobilized Russian troops deployed to the area. So in this video, we'll break down the latest updates on the battlefield and explain why things have continued to slow down. Before we start, TLDR EU is currently only just behind TLDR UK's subscriber count. So if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and help TLDR EU win the subscriber race. Before we get into what's going on in Bakhmut, let's have a quick look at what's happening elsewhere along the front lines. Generally, there hasn't been all that much movement along the front lines, and this is mainly because it looks like Ukraine has changed strategy somewhat. We're seeing less big combined arms maneuvers involving lots of troops and tanks, and it looks like Ukraine has now returned to a more attritional strategy, with a renewed focus on Russia's logistics. We saw this with the attack on the Kerch Bridge earlier this week, which put a strain on Russia's logistics in the south, and it's probably why Ukraine is asking for artillery ammunitions instead of tanks at the moment. This change of strategy is probably for two reasons. First, the Russian defence has held up better than most people expected so far, and Ukraine has decided it needs to soften up these defences before trying again. And second, Ukraine has received its first batch of American cluster munitions earlier this month, and is due to receive more cluster munitions and possibly F-16s later this year. They're presumably trying to use these cluster munitions to break down Russia's defences, and if the F-16s arrive sometime soon, it'll allow Ukraine to push back against Russia's air superiority, which has proved remarkably effective in the past few months. With this new strategy, the Ukrainians have made some progress around Robotny, reaching Russia's first defensive line, but they're yet to actually enter Robotny itself. The only other place, apart from Bakhmut, where the front lines have moved a bit is in the northeast, around Kupiansk and Kreminna. For context, Kupiansk is a small town in the east of Kharkiv Oblast that used to act as a logistics hub for Russians in the east until the Ukrainians recaptured it during their Kharkiv counteroffensive in September of last year. While the Ukrainians have a pretty solid grip on the town, the Russians still control the P-79 road running into the city from Belgorod Oblast, and in the past few days, the Russians have started trying to move south along the road towards the town, with limited success. According to reports, the Russians have progressed roughly 2 kilometers in the past couple of days along the road, and Ukraine's Eastern Army Command claims that Russia has gathered some 100,000 troops, 900 tanks, and 555 artillery systems in the area. Kreminna is a town roughly 90 kilometers south of Kupiansk, on the border between Kharkiv and Luhansk oblasts. For the past year or so, the Ukrainians have been trying to break through here, because Kreminna lies along the P-66 highway, which sends supplies from Belgorod and other supply depots in western Russia down to places like Rubizny, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk and Bakhmut. However, about a week ago, the Russians pushed back against the Ukrainian efforts here, and Russian forces advanced a couple of kilometers westwards in the forest to the west of Kreminna. Unfortunately for the Russians, geolocated footage suggests that they were pushed back a couple of days later, but it's still something for the Ukrainians to keep an eye on, given the density of Russia's troop presence in the region. So that's what's happening elsewhere along the front lines. Now let's take a look at Bakhmut. As we've explained in previous videos, since Wagner took the town in May, the Ukrainians have been pushing back along the north and south flanks. When we did our last Ukraine battlefield update, Ukrainian troops, buoyed by the Wagner-related chaos in Russia, had made good progress, especially in the south around the suburb of Klitschivka.
Since then, they've continued to advance, and earlier this week, they established control over the heights around Klishchivka. Control of these territories, which lie just to the west of the suburb, should basically allow the Ukrainians to shell the Russians out of Klishchivka, and unless something significant changes, the Ukrainians should be able to take the suburb in the near future. Earlier this month, there were reports of Russian troops retreating from Klishchivka, and a few days later, a video appeared on Russian Telegram channels of recently mobilized Russian troops complaining about the situation in the area and refusing to follow what they described as suicidal orders. The Ukrainians have also had some success to the north of Bakhmut. Having reached the suburb of Berkivka, the Ukrainians are now trying to push the Russians back around Vasyukivka, which lies a few kilometers further north and prevents the Russians from encircling Ukraine's new positions. Now, it's important not to overstate these gains. Ukrainian gains to the north of Bakhmut around Berkivka are only a couple of kilometers at most, and while the Ukrainians have made strategically significant gains in the south around Klishchivka, in raw territorial terms, it's only a few kilometers, and they're still yet to take the suburb itself. Nonetheless, Ukraine's success around Bakhmut is interesting for two reasons. First, it's worth comparing this to what's happened along the other parts of the front lines, like Zaporizhia, where Ukraine has struggled a bit more. This is largely because Russia is better prepared for rural combat. They've mined the fields in Zaporizhia, which makes mechanized offences difficult, and air superiority is more effective in rural areas, when troops and tanks have to cross empty fields out in the open. Second, it's interesting because even though Bakhmut doesn't have much strategic value, it's an effective pressure point because of its symbolic value. If Ukraine takes Bakhmut, it's unlikely to proceed a further sweeping advance into Donbass, because it doesn't have much strategic value. However, it would be deeply humiliating for the Kremlin, who have trumpeted the taking of Bakhmut as Russia's single significant military success in the past year or so. Given Ukraine's relative success here and Bakhmut's symbolic value, it'll be interesting to see how much Kyiv decides to commit to the area in the next phase of the counteroffensive.
And there's a whole lot more happening around the world too. Ukraine might capture the headlines, but it's far from the only contemporary conflict. In fact, Real Life Law's Superb Modern Conflicts is a brilliant series which runs you through all kinds of ongoing and recent crises. Through this series' beautiful visuals and incredibly detailed research, you can learn about everything from the ongoing and troubling civil war in Ethiopia, which we've discussed a number of times on TLDR Global, the latest on the war in Ukraine, or how the rise of ISIS shook the Middle East. If that sounds good to you, then you can watch this series alongside a load of others which perfectly complement TLDR videos, exclusively on our streaming service, Nebula, where you can also find a bunch of TLDR content too. That's because we post all of our videos ad-free on Nebula, as well as sharing some of our videos there before they ever make it to YouTube. Not only that, we also release hours worth of content only on Nebula every month, from extended editions of our show The Daily Briefing to exclusive explainers and behind the scenes clips. And the good news is that all of this, TLDR content, exclusive documentary series, and a bunch of other brilliant creators are available at a great price. That's because if you sign up using our link in the description, then you can get Nebula for less than £2 a month. So help out the channel and learn more by signing up to Nebula. Thanks for your support.